welcome to our exciting webinar planning. Should we do it in the ERP? Should we do it in the APS? So I will try to summarize a bit. What do I see companies are doing in ERP and what is working in ERP and what's the difference between planning in an ERP and planning in an APS, and when do you need an APS? I will also try to pause a bit around the question, if I need an APS, do I then use the APS of the ERP vendor, or should I go for a different system? So I'll share some of our experiences there, and also what I see with customers and what I see with companies I talk to. But before I jump into any content, let me start with a couple of questions. So I will use Mentimeter to get some of your input before I dive into the content. And let me switch to Mentimeter now. And let me ask you a first question, like which systems are you currently using to do your supply chain planning? So I see that 7 people already responded. Again, join me on menti.com and you see the code here on top, 29217930. So tell me what you are using to do your planning. So I see Power BI, I see the ERP, I see Board, which I see a lot more in the financial planning area. I see OMP, which is one of our partners. I see SAP, and I see a lot of Excel. That's indeed what I see as well, that we may have part of the planning in the ERP, but then the rest is taken care of with Excel, or we may have part of it in an advanced planning system, part of it in the ERP, and then we bridge the gap by a lot of Excels. KBS, an own system. So yes, we do develop our own planning system. And this is probably like SAP for the short-term planning, Excel for the short-term planning, and like Board for the long-term forecast. So having different planning systems for a different planning horizon, that's maybe a good question also to come back to. Let me ask you a second question here through Mentimeter. What's your biggest struggle when it comes to properly doing your supply chain planning? So you shared a bit, what are your current planning tools? What do you see as your biggest struggle when it comes to properly doing your supply chain planning? It might be that you say, well, I'm perfectly happy with the planning solution I currently have. And if you're not perfectly happy, what do you consider to be your biggest struggle? Current systems are not a 100% fit to the requirements for properly doing the planning, which causes problems. Lack of visibility, data quality, visibility end-to-end, capturing the detailed labor capacity. So that's more almost like a modeling challenge. Visibility on an aggregated level, I will come back to that. Scalability and visibility linked to the long-term planning, like also if we have different planning processes with a different horizon, and certainly if these are in different systems, how do we connect the different planning processes and the different planning systems? Scenarios, I will also come back to scenarios, data-driven scenarios. I will come back to that argument, but if we want to have meaningful S&OP meetings, I believe scenarios are key. Connection between the ERP and the financial planning tool is a challenge. It's difficult for users. No long-term planning. That's also something I see, that yes, some companies do short-term planning and they might do the short-term planning in the ERP. But if we don't have a long-term plan or a long-term visibility, we don't see the issues coming. And if we don't see issues coming and all the issues hit the short-term planning window, short-term planning can become a complete disaster. Volatility, low forecast accuracy, yeah, for sure. I have a nuanced view on that. I also sometimes say to companies, not everything can be solved through planning. And we can dream about a perfect forecast, but sometimes we also need to design our operations for more flexibility. And it's not always what companies want to hear, but I believe it's sometimes what they need to know or understand. Missing financial reporting, management attention moving often to the short-term issues, engagement with the other business functions. Okay. And then last question. What question would you like to get answered in this webinar? It's a relatively broad topic as we announced it. I also cannot promise I will be able to answer all of your questions, but yeah, why did you subscribe to this planning in ERP versus APS? What's maybe the question? What was triggering you, or what was the question that you have on the table today, and where you say I really hope to get more insights on this or on that aspect. Pause for a second. Any specific questions, or if there's no specific questions, yeah, what triggered your participation in this webinar? How to enhance the supply planning process, the added value of APS, understand APS added value versus ERP. I hope to shed some light on that. I know SAP and IT will push to go for IBP. Yeah, I agree. I see that happening as well. So I'll try to give my opinion on that. Why, how, and when using APS. We'll come back to that. To be less transactional in the data usage, more dynamic planning, less comprehensive in the preparation, APS versus ERP. What not to do when selecting APS, okay. Possible pitfalls. So I'll share. I'll share some typical considerations on selecting an APS and when to do APS, and I'll also share some experiences on questions and struggles I see within the company, and the benefit of one source of truth. Okay. Also near the end of the webinar, I will try to add a bit, maybe create a longer term vision on that one source of truth. But let me jump back to my presentation, and I want to pause a bit, what is an ERP? What is an ERP, and where is ERP coming from, and what are basic capabilities we can expect from an ERP solution? I will then do the same for APS and say, what is an APS? What is an advanced planning system? What can we typically expect from an APS? To then come to the question, do we need an APS, yes or no? And if we need an APS, should we go for the APS of the ERP vendor, or should we go for a best of breed? But let's start with what is an ERP system. And I didn't invent this myself. I just went to the website of a major ERP vendor, being SAP. Most ERP solutions consist of different modules which are supporting a functional process. It could be the finance process, it could be a sales process, and it's connected to one common database, and it's working on one centralized database and data model. And like in sales, we might have the capability to deal with sales orders. In manufacturing, we might have the capability to deal with manufacturing orders. In sourcing and procurement, we may have the capability to deal with purchase orders. And in general, ERP systems come from a transactional background. So a lot of it is order driven or driven by transactions. And if you look at some more details, so again, these are the most widely used ERP modules. I won't go through them in detail. What I notice is that if companies implement ERP, certainly in the past, the first modules which are being brought live are the financial models. And so helping complex organizations to more quickly and efficiently do a financial consolidation. Yeah, that's certainly one of the reasons why companies have been implementing and are still implementing ERP systems. Yeah. And then the other modules may go at once, or they may go step by step. I've seen different approaches there. But yeah, these are typical ERP modules, and you will get the slides later on. And if you look at the ERP revolution, ERP at some point in time was quite revolutionary. And why was that? Because if you look at the 70s here, there were a lot of standalone applications. And maybe as a company, we had an application to do finance and accounting. And we maybe had an application to do sales order processing or to do material planning, but these applications were not connected. And then in the 80s, as you see here, I would say with MRP as a basis, ERP systems started to connect the different functions: finance and accounting, sales order processing, purchasing, and inventory. So can an ERP system do planning? Well, at least ERP systems come from material requirements planning, or MRP. And also as Solventure today, when it's about MRP, certainly for the full BOM, we quite often say, that's what an ERP is built for. So then use the ERP system to do the MRP calculation. You don't necessarily want to duplicate all of that into your advanced planning system. Then there was the MRP2, so we added some other functions. And if you ask me, since then, the core functionality of ERP solutions has been more or less the same. And it has been more about changing technologies. And just to take an example, so I'm doing this for 15 years. In the beginning, we were talking about R3. You see the typical modules of SAP R3 here. Then it was about SAP ECC. You see the different modules here of SAP ECC. They are the same. Now I see a lot of companies who are discussing the migration from SAP ECC into S4. When you're talking about S4, again, you will see comparable modules as we've seen 20 years ago. So I'm simplifying a bit, but if you ask me, ERP systems are in essence doing the same as 20 years ago. And the main change driver over the last few years has been a change in technology, with the latest move being moving everything to the cloud. What is then an advanced planning system? Well, to explain what an APS does, I went back to a book that I read myself 20 years ago. It's from two gentlemen, Stadler and Kilber. It's still, I would say, it's still a very actual and good book if you want to understand APS. So it talks about what do APS systems do. It even has a chapter on, okay, if I do an RFP, how should I approach the RFP for the APS system? And they start from what I would say the typical hierarchical supply chain planning model. And hierarchical supply chain planning says we need to make plans and we need to make them at different horizons. And so for sure, I need to make a more longer term strategic plan. A typical example there is doing the design of my distribution network. I may need to have a midterm plan, for instance, to plan my capacities and capacities extensions, which is driven by a midterm or longer term forecast. And then I will have shorter term planning, driven by shorter term forecasting and or orders and or projects and or tenders or what have you. So the information might be a little bit different. And that is really driving the shorter term production planning and distribution planning and warehouse planning and so on. And these are the typical modules that are being, let us say, suggested in this book, and it's something that I recognize. And so a lot of the tools may have a demand planning module. Some of them may have an ATP module. They may have a DRP module, a production planning module. Master planning is here used as a terminology for the midterm planning. I more often use RCCP or rough cut capacity planning to address that level. Some of them may have strategic network planning, and like not all tools give the full coverage. If you look at strategic network planning, that's where a tool like Lamasoft was especially strong. And Lamasoft has been bought by Coupa Software, but Lamasoft was not necessarily good in the midterm or short-term planning. If you take a look at Kinexis, I think is especially good in that midterm planning. But when it comes to scheduling, they are working together with a partner called Planet together. Yeah. So if this is what APS systems are doing, I would even say that not all APS systems are providing the full coverage. And I don't necessarily think that is a problem either. May come back to that later. And it has to do with planning horizons. So also when we do planning projects, for me, that makes sense. Like I may need an RCCP process, which is looking 12 to 18 months out. Yeah? And it's basically about planning my capacity. So which lines are getting full. And basically I need to look far enough in the future to be able to plan capacity extensions. And so the RCCP should drive capacity extensions. Then I may have a master plan, which is looking 4 to 12 weeks out. The MPS or master plan is typically driving the MRP calculation. Yeah, so typically the horizon is defined by my longest lead time components. Yeah. If many of my components or raw materials, I need to order them 12 weeks ahead. Yeah, then I want to make a master plan which looks at least 12 weeks ahead. And then I have my production scheduling. Yeah, so once the raw materials are available, let's suppose that my production lead time is 10 days. It takes 10 days to actually manufacture the product because maybe there's a couple of intermediate steps. Well, if the production itself takes 10 days, I will need to schedule at least 10 days ahead. And of course, the ranges here are indicative. It will be different company per company. Yeah. If it really takes 10 days to produce something, yeah, then this will be more or less frozen. It will be very hard to still intervene. The master plan, we call it flexible in the sense that, yeah, the raw materials have in theory been ordered. So I still can decide what to make from the raw materials, but it's hard to increase, for instance, the raw material supply. Yeah, over here, yeah, it's typically called free, but it is not fully free because if it takes 18 months to expand my capacity, yeah, I may have a capacity constraint here. And the idea of planning remains that, okay, the further out I am, the more I am in a situation that I can manage the supply to meet the demand. And obviously, the closer I get to the actual production, yeah, the more I'm in a situation that it will be about managing the demand to meet the supply. But when we do planning projects, I'm still a fan of having the different planning processes with a different horizon. So if we make our Solventure representation of what an APS does and what an ERP does, yeah, this is a picture that we have been using a lot in the past. And so if these are more strategic processes here on top, what a typical APS does is in the green box here. It may have a demand module, it may have an inventory module to calculate inventory parameters like safety stocks. We may have something for RCCP for MPS and detailed scheduling. I may have a DRP system, which is helping me with the replenishment of the distribution network. Yeah, we may have a transport planning module, especially like if I'm in chemicals, yeah, and the transport is done in the rail cars, yeah, then it becomes very hard to decouple the transport planning from the production planning, either MPS or detailed scheduling. And when it comes to MRP, yeah, as I said in the beginning, an ERP comes from MRP. So in general, in our projects, I would say when it's about the full BOM, and the full MRP that's typically run in the ERP system. But you might take critical components or raw materials into account in your MPS plan, because constraints cannot just be on capacity, but constraints increasingly can also be on available raw materials or semi-finished. So that's why you would take it into account. And yeah, before I go on, obviously, if you use an APS, you need a good connection to the ERP system, because if you want to do demand planning and forecasting here, we will need to load transactional data. We will need to load customer master data, material master data into the demand planning system. And assume that I would only use the demand module. Most probably I want to load the forecast back into the ERP system so that the forecast in the ERP can trigger the MRP calculation. Assume, for instance, that I would also have an MPS in my APS. Then instead of loading the forecast back into the ERP system, I might load production orders and production requirements into the ERP system, again, to trigger the full BOM over there. But good integration capabilities are key. And I think that's what we learned as Solventure already 10 years ago. So we have invested in our own proprietary connector, which allows us to easily get data out of the ERP into the APS and from the APS back into the ERP system. And that connector not only allows to do it faster, but it also allows to solve more complex data puzzles, because I see a lot of companies who say, it's SAP, but it's not one version of SAP. It's 3 versions of SAP, or it's the same version, but it's 3 instances, or next to SAP, we still have this type of planning system in the UK and another planning system, I don't know, in Spain or somewhere in the US. So having connectivity with different ERP systems is also one of the challenges we typically face, and where good connectivity solutions are needed to be able to do a decent job in the planning implementation. And as I talked about the ERP revolution, I think we also had an APS revolution, and that APS revolution, I think, started as of the 80s, and some of the early champions were companies like i2 or Managistics, which are no longer around because they have been bought by some of the bigger players in the meantime. And a lot of those early APS champions were spin-offs of universities. Also, if you look at OMP, OMP was a spin-off of the University of Antwerp. And these type of companies were using OR methods, operations research methods, like solvers and heuristics. And I think these solutions started by being more advanced from an algorithmic perspective. And that's also why it's called advanced planning. And with those solvers and heuristics, as an example, APS systems could and still can account for all kinds of constraints. So you can add capacity constraints, you may add a production wheel. Increasingly, it's not just about the capacity or a certain sequence, but we say, hey, suppliers don't always deliver, so we may have a constraint on raw materials, or we may have constraints on specific tool sets, or we may even have constraints on people, on specific operators who have been trained to execute specific jobs. So constraints are everywhere, and I think APS systems are especially good in modeling all kinds of constraints. If you look at MRP and planning in ERP systems, most of the examples I have seen are capacity unconstrained. And I've literally seen companies who try to do planning with the ERP system. And so all the requirements basically run through the MRP and then come into some kind of scheduling board. But the amount of orders that need to be scheduled are significantly higher than the capacity we have available. Well, if I, as a scheduler, Instead of just scheduling, also need to make a capacity feasible plan. And I think it's problematic. Yeah. Another challenge I see is that ERP systems in general are good to calculate from the customer demands towards the requirements for raw materials. But ERP systems are especially problematic, but if the supply is not coming in, if one of our suppliers is not delivering, how do I calculate back from that raw material on which customer orders or which forecast or replenishments are now basically constrained, and what are then the options? So there is a couple of limitations to planning in ERP systems, which I think APS systems do a much better job in tackling. Solvers heuristics, then forecasting algorithms. All kinds of extrapolation methods. And so there's a whole library of forecasting algorithms, which you don't have in ERP. Regression methods, which allow you to include external data. Many of these APS systems also allow to automatically select the best forecasting method. They may have inventory algorithms. When we get RFPs for APS systems, we also get a lot of questions around this type of functionality, like can your tool do this? Can your tool do that? That's typically where a lot of the questions are centered. And it's called advanced planning. So yes, it's driven certainly by the fact that there are more advanced algorithms which help you to better deal with the complexity of your supply chain. But in that APS revolution, it was also about integrating the plans. And so in the past, like in the 80s, some tools were doing demand planning, some tools were doing supply planning, but there were not really tools who were integrating demand, supply, and inventory. So the APS systems, I would say, almost a bit comparable to what ERP systems did. So the early APS systems for sure also integrated demand, supply, and inventory modeling. Good. And like we had the ERP evolution, if you ask me today, there is also an APS evolution. So we've been a long-term partner of Arqiva. When I started, we were still selling the Demeter, and that was a VB development, Visual Basic development. Then that moved to .NET, and that became Arqiva. Now Arqiva is making the transition to the cloud and a full SaaS application. So if you ask me, APS systems are in essence doing the same as 20 years ago, and the main change has been technological. And in the last part of this webinar, I will challenge a bit where I believe APS solutions or supply chain planning solutions could go. What do we think we need? And so do we need an APS solution? I think the short answer is yes. Yeah, you need an APS. And I will try to give a couple of examples. And so on the right here, I summarized our vision on S&OP. And at the center here, you see the triangle, and then you see a circle. And in that circle, you see scenario management, volume and value, aggregation, disaggregation. And let me focus here on the executive S&OP. I see a lot of executive S&OP meetings, which are death by PowerPoint. We present 10 slides on forecast accuracy, and then we present 10 slides on inventory, and then we present 10 slides on service level. I already disconnect after slide number 3. If we want to make sense out of executive S&OP, we need to turn it into a decision-making meeting. If we want to make decisions in the S&OP meeting, we need to be able to calculate scenarios. That's something that APS systems can support. It's typically very hard, if not impossible, to run scenarios with an ERP system. If we run scenarios, we need good aggregation, disaggregation capabilities. Planning, the devil is in the details. In the end, I need to make a specific product on a specific machine, and it will consume a specific raw material. So planning starts from the details. The constraints are really in the details. But I need to be able to summarize it at an aggregated level. So what's then the impact on this product group, or what's then the impact on that country? So I need to, again, if I want to turn the SNOP meeting into a decision-making meeting, I need to run scenarios and I need to show the impact on an aggregated level. I also need to be able to show the impact in value, not in volume, like, yeah, what's the impact in tons or what's the impact in square meters? No, I need to be able to say what's the impact in euros. And I need to be able to show 2 or 3 options to say, we can cut all countries pro rata. We can try to preserve those 2 or 3 growth markets. And once I've made a certain decision in value, I need to be able to easily disaggregate my decision back to the lower level detail. And if this is what we need to do a proper SNOP, we will never get there without an APS system. It's impossible to do that with an ERP system. And what are extra reasons that you need an APS? I would say it's to account for real life complexities. If you need to install a production wheel, you can model it in an APS. It will require a lot of customization to do it in the ERP. Yeah, a lot of the ERP implementations I have seen are capacity unconstrained. In today's volatile markets, that's not good enough. We may have capacity constraints in production. We might even have them in warehousing. APS tools will also be quite flexible in modeling those type of constraints. Constraints are not just in production or warehousing. They can be in the intermediates, in the raw materials, in the key tools or the personnel. Again, it will be very hard to model that or account for that in an ERP system. I might have a need to model unique flows. I may have contract manufacturing or co-packers. That's where APS systems make the difference. So do you need an APS? I strongly believe yes. And once I decide to go for an APS, should I then go for a best of breed system? Like we have Archiva, Kinexus, OMP, more optimal, or should I go with the APS of the ERP? And in the case of SAP, that would be SAP IBP. Well, this is research done by Laura Ceciri, which you might know from Supply Chain Insights. And she said, okay, I've done a survey, I've asked a couple of questions, and so people who have been using best of breed systems, what you see, 49% of them had the technology provider as the implementation partner, whereas with the ERP expansionist, it was only 14%. And I will come back to that. It's not just about the technology, it's also about the knowledge of the person who is implementing the technology. Time to implement, 71% here, 12 months or less, versus 37% for ERP add-ons. Early on time, 56 versus 37. Under or on budget, 59 versus 40. Time to ROI, 9 months or less, 34 versus 11. And satisfaction, 81 versus 63. So why would companies implement solutions that cost more, were longer to deploy, and had lower user satisfaction? And the fact that we are reselling and implementing the best of breed makes me biased, of course. But you could say this is independent research, and the link is included here, so you can check that for yourself and use it internally. Other typical questions. Should we first do the ERP and then go for the APS? Because people say, we have 5 different SAP ECC systems and we're going to migrate to one S4HANA. The master data is currently not aligned, so maybe we should first go to S4, and then we can do the APS. That might be logical from a from a technical perspective. But there's 2 big issues with that. I would never accept it from a supply chain point of view. Why? If they tell you that the ERP project will take 3 years, you know it will not take 3 years, but it will take 6 years. And 6 years is basically too long to wait for a decent planning system. And 2, as I said, that's only the technical perspective. If I take a value perspective or a business perspective, the center here is that supply chain triangle. And I really believe that planning processes can help a lot to drive a better balance in that triangle. And an APS system as such can really help you to at the same time improve service, reduce cost, and reduce inventories. And if you look at the ERP, what's the business case for an ERP? Well, basically, we will be doing the same as we are doing today. We will only be doing it in a different technology. Still, an ERP costs a factor 10 more than the APS is costing. So if you look at the value generation perspective, the APS is much cheaper. And because it's really at the center of that supply chain triangle, the business value will generate is a lot larger. So I would say the more courageous companies say it's not one or the other, both will go in parallel. It does imply that you will need to connect the APS maybe to different ERP systems today. But as I've shown before, there are good connectors and data technologies available for that. Pitfalls: too much focus on the technology and too little on the implementation partner. I've seen people who told me, we're using Anaplan and it's a very bad tool. I say, no, Anaplan is not a bad tool. It has only been implemented by somebody who doesn't understand supply chain planning. Also, when we get RFPs, there's a lot of questions like, can the tool do this? Can the tool do that? Can the tool do that? The answer is most probably yes. If you look at all the tools who are in the magic quadrant, those tools are doing for 90% the same, because if one is better in one aspect or in another aspect, people will copy each other. It's a relatively mature market. So the difference might not even be in the technology. The difference might be with the implementation partner. Process first. So let's start with Excel. Well, one, our current supply chains are way too complex to manage them with Excel. So you will need to move to an APS system anyway. Remember that that APS system has a direct impact on service cost and cash. So making the business case should not be that difficult. And starting with Excel is even dangerous, because if you start a demand planning process or a demand review meeting and you ask salespeople to validate forecasts with Excel, it will be so cumbersome that you have lost the buy-in even before you decently get started. So I don't think starting with Excel is a good idea. We should be more courageous. And then I see things like the APS of the ERP vendor comes with native integration. Should I go for the APS of the ERP vendor, or should I go for a best of breed? My feeling is that if you ask the business people always go for the best of breed. They will never go for the APS of the ERP vendor. And it's typically IT who is pushing to have the APS of the ERP vendor. Why is that? Because they're not doing the planning, and it has the same logo, so it feels more trusted to them. And any decision is good as long as it's based on correct information. And then I hear companies saying, but the APS of the ERP vendor comes with native integration. Well, I see examples where people tell me, Bram, that's not true. So if you're being pushed by IT to use the APS of the ERP vendor, we're happy to provide you with some references with, for example, no, the integration is not native. It's as difficult as integrating another APS system. So that whatever this decision you make, at least you make it based on correct information. And there's many more pitfalls. See some questions coming in here. So how do you calculate the ROI of S&OP? And I would say we can follow up offline, but we typically start from that triangle. What are possible service improvements? What are possible cost improvements? And what are possible working capital improvements? Or how can we better leverage our existing assets? And then you try to couple it to financials. Our experience is that the return on investment, or the payback period, let's put it like that, for investing in an APS is 6 to 12 months. If you try to make the payback for an ERP implementation, probably there is no payback. It's like the ERP we have to do it. It's a license to operate. It's a must-have investment. But I think that doesn't necessarily feel fair, knowing that the ERP system costs a factor 10 of the planning system. So I think in general, we should do a better job as supply chain people also to firmly pitch it towards the executive team. Cleaning master data and transactions. No, I will come back to that question on the data. Given the time, I will skip that vision here on the future of integrated planning if you are interested. Yeah, so I have a vision on where S&OP and integrated planning should go. I call it integrated value planning, or S&OP 2.0, but given the time, I will skip that. We have a separate webinar and recording on that. So if you want to know my vision on where S&OP should be going and what is the impact on planning systems, we can share the recording, and we're happy to follow up with you offline. And that's linked here to my latest book. And tying into that data question, so how can Solventure help? Well, we have a lot of experience in this. So we are partnering with different APS vendors. We have built our own integration capabilities. And to answer one of the questions here is, should you start with cleaning the master data and transactions? Yeah, the answer is yes. And so we have recently developed a data quality scan. And I even say to our teams, like, okay, instead of starting with a blueprint session on what the tool should do, let's start with the data quality assessment, and let's put the customer and the customer teams to work to clean the data up. And basically, if we see the data, there's maybe already half of the theoretical options which we can forget about, because we say, yeah, your data quality or your data maturity is at a level that it's too risky to have this or that level of ambition. So in these type of projects, data is key, and data should be a starting point. We really shouldn't wait for the time we are implementing. And another product we have here is our Solventure Perform, I would say, which is helping companies to get a better visibility on how good their product portfolio is. It's supporting the product management review step in the traditional S&OP process. Why? Because we see that portfolio management and having a more financial or value-driven view on product portfolios is absent as a functionality in most of the existing APS systems. Another question here from Johan: how will the APS landscape evolve in the next 5 years? Short answer, I would say I expect to see more AI and more AI capabilities in, whether it's about AI in forecasting and demand sensing and better predicting the impact of promotions, or better modeling like cannibalization, or whether it's about helping planners with defining possible options on how to solve a certain planning issue. So I think the solutions will become more augmented by better leveraging those AI technologies. But the biggest challenge I see is the biggest challenge I put on APS vendors is that their focus is too narrow. APS systems are only solving the supply chain problem, and that is problematic, because, to give just one example, I still see a lot of companies where sales needs to submit a financial forecast to finance, and they need to submit a supply chain forecast to supply chain. But if sales needs to submit 2 forecasts, we know what we are going to get. When they submit the forecast to finance, they will be conservative, they will do sandbagging. When they submit the forecast towards supply chain, they will be optimistic, they will over forecast. So by having a narrow focus on supply chain, there are some structural issues or deficiencies in the current approach. And there is not a lot of incentive for APS vendors to get outside of that box, because all the requirements that are being listed are the very traditional APS requirements, which I just talked about and which are 20 years old. So I would hope that planning systems more go towards connected planning or that integrated value planning. And there are some financial tools like Anaplan who claim that, but they're not really supporting it from a functionality perspective or a data model perspective. But I do believe it's one of the directions that APS systems should go to. So happy to answer more questions because I see our time is more or less up. Time always flies. So not sure if there's extra questions. Also don't hesitate to reach out to us via email or contact with me on LinkedIn. I hope I have been able to give you a better understanding on what is ERP doing, what is APS doing. Do we need an APS, yes or no? If you need help to build a business case, we have experience with that. We have different APS systems. We can also even like try to model or do a proof of concept. So we make it more tangible, like if we would do this in the ERP versus if we would do it in an APS system, what is the practical difference? And also doing a proof of concept might be a better alternative to doing an RFP, because in an RFP you spend a lot of time, but you don't necessarily get a lot of deeper insights. I think from a proof of concept, you learn a lot more. So if there's no other questions, I will close it here. I want to thank you for participating, and there's maybe one last question going on. So just a thank you. So thank you for attending, and hope to meet you at a next webinar or at a next physical event somewhere in Belgium or abroad. So thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day.